conservative, but it was strange because even though the women were probably some of the most conservative women in the United States at that time, by culture, I mean, not by choice, but by culture. Creole culture was very, very conservative. And women basically lived and died for their husbands and their children. They were supposed to basically
dedicate,
subsume, like basically sublimate their entire being for their husbands and their children. And they believed that was their duty. They believed that this was ordained by God, that this was what they were supposed to do. And there are still people who believe these things quite sincerely. And I'm not going to disparage that, but I'm just saying, like, there are women and men who believe that just as much as some people believed that the kings from England were direct descendants of God, that they were actual, like, gods, and that was God's chosen family to stay on the throne. So, again, but Creole culture, very conservative, but at the same time, the women could very openly, if they were married, usually, could very openly talk about sex. Which might seem odd to you, but the reason why they could do that is because their chastity, their dedication to their husbands and their marriages was never, ever questioned. Ever. To even think that a woman would commit adultery was, you couldn't, that would just never happen. They just couldn't imagine something like that could ever happen. And there were serious, serious punishments for women, not so much for the men, because for the men, it was almost expected that they would have affairs and mistresses and things like that. But if the woman did, yeah, the laws were very much against her. So then in 1882, she starts writing short stories, things like that. Then in 1882, her husband dies, and she moves back to St. Louis to be with her mother, or I think her grandmother, in 1882. That, you don't have to remember that, but just to know the time frame. Olivia?
When wives, when their husbands die, are they allowed to remarry, or at that time is it like...
Oh, that was another very interesting thing. Not only were they allowed to remarry, but they were expected to remarry as soon as possible.
Oh.
Because number one, being a single female, nope. That's where we get the word spinster, because they would just sit home spinning yarn. From a modern perspective, it's just like, yeah, that'd be nice. But again, like at that time, women were expected to be married. And again, keep in mind, this is also like Creole culture, but this is also kind of American culture as well, that women were expected to be married. They were not supposed to be single. And if you were single, it also limited your ability to socialize in public. Because you were not as trustworthy as if you were married. Because if you were married, that meant that your husband could control you, and therefore you could go out and socialize in the world. But if you were single, and you'd be still living at home, so you'd have your father, but God forbid if your father had died, you're basically, unless you get married as soon as possible, your opportunities are thin on the ground, basically. So she moves back to she moves back to St. Louis to be with her family, her grandmother and everything. But unfortunately, she's left with a lot of debt, so she starts doing a lot of writing, a lot of short story writing, and actually her short stories are very, very popular. And she's making a really good living from writing these short stories. But people start to notice that her short stories every year they're getting a little bit, wait, what is this woman doing? And then the next short story, what is this woman? Am I reading this right? And then eventually we lead up to 1899, which is when she publishes The Awakening, and literally all hell breaks loose. It's called Pornography. It's completely, it's shunned, she is shunned from society. She was still a pretty, high-ranking member of society. She was a famous writer, at least in St. Louis, and, other people knew who she was. She was completely shunned. All of her friends basically dumped her immediately, her friends. Again, nobody would basically publish her works. A few years later, she actually is, well, I don't know, there's some debate, but she actually writes a public apology.
Oh, God.
Which to me, in my mind, is probably what killed her. To me, that was probably what really just ended her, was having to write that public apology. And I have a feeling, although this is speculated by scholars, but I kind of agree, that she pretty much did it for her children. Because she was prepared, I think, to have her career destroyed, but not her life, necessarily. So I think, but I agree with some scholars, that maybe she wrote this public apology in part to try to regain some kind of footing in the world for her family or things like that. She gets a couple short stories published after that, but basically 5 years after she writes The Awakening, she dies. And she's 54, which that even at that time period is still quite young, especially if you're wealthy. If you have money and resources to medical things like that, which she did. So basically 5 years later, she dies at the age of 54. So guys, I just kind of wanted to explain some of that information. I'm going to really quickly just hand this out. Oh, I might have to amend our schedule next week. There you go. There we go. There we go. There we go. There you go, guys. There you go. You're welcome. Ruby, there you go. You're very welcome.
I think I'll take
you. That's right. I forgot. I forgot. And so, guys, I'm just going to really quickly talk about some of this stuff in here. The first thing I just want you to open up in the photo I talked about yesterday. 5 years.
Oh my God, seriously?
Mm-hmm.
5 years.
So that is her in 1894. By the time she decides to publish The Awakening in 1899, that's what she looked like in 1899.
But she hadn't published a book yet until 1899, so what was happening before?
I think part of it was also her own internal struggle of basically realizing that she wants to start doing this kind of writing. She wants to start writing more about female empowerment and women's identity and giving women a voice, and knowing that that's what you want to do, that's very, very stressful. And the fact, again, at the very top of that page, I've included the quote that comes from The Awakening, which is, "The artist must possess the courageous soul that dares and defies." And Chopin believed that. And so that, I think all of that stress, because from 1894 on is when her writing starts to get a little bit more out there as far as women's identity, giving women more of a voice, giving women kind of the upper hand in some of her short stories toward the men, which again, there was already some mumbling about what was happening, but nobody was prepared for The Awakening. So when she finally makes the decision to publish The Awakening, I think by then the whole idea had already started to take quite a physical toll on her mentally, physically, psychologically, everything, but she still decides to do it, and then 5 years after this picture is when she dies. So I've also just included on the next page the dresses that you might see women wearing, and the waists are not an exaggeration.
Oh my God.
That was the feminine ideal. White skin and a 12-inch waist. The ideal was especially if a man could put his hands around a woman's waist.
My hands are big, very easy for self-image.
That was kind of like the real feminine ideal. If you could get to that point. So, and again, it just says the following illustrations demonstrate quite well how women and men were seen in society during this time. Women were typically portrayed as restrained, petite, and proper, yet, and this is very interesting, in fiction, a lot of women are portrayed as being very catty. Do you know what catty is?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like petty and meow, like that kind of, that's where we get that meow, that's where we get that is from the word being catty, like a cat, basically. Kind of vengeful and petty sort of thing. Vicious, manipulative, and vacuous, meaning that women at this time were deemed to have the mentality of infants. They actually believed that women did not have the mental capacity, and there's still people who believe that today, that women do not have the same mental capacity that men do. That was very ingrained in society back then, and in Louisiana, by law, women were given the same status as infants when it came to law. What's that?
All of my high school teachers all thought that Africa was kind of
It's something that is still pervasive today. It hasn't ended. It hasn't ended. People believed, again, that people of color, like, black people or whatever, that there was no way that they were savages. That there was no way that they could possibly have the mental capacity that a Caucasian person could. And people believed this. It wasn't an idea, it was a belief. So the next ones that I've talked about here is just, again, the idea of fin de siècle and some of the cartoons that would actually make fun of society, which happened. And again, guys, if you want to take off anytime, I'm not going to begrudge anybody to take off if they want to or have to, really. And then, so that's this. So what I'm going to do actually is, for right now, I'm not going to give you, if you want, you can read through the rest of this at the beginning of class on Tuesday. What I'm going to do is we're going to go through some of these things together because there's other things that I have to explain, like, for example, in the illustration where it says punch or the London shibari. The shibari is a really important part of culture at this time, so I want to explain what the shibari is because this is...
Is it chivalry?
No, shibari. It's on this page.
yeah,
French.